Who invited him here? Don't tell me this was the bride's doing. A cold, whispered voice echoed through the dead silent church. Every eye turned to the elderly man, standing alone by the entrancee's silver beard, frayed jacket shoulders, and worn backpack unmistakable against the pristine ceremony. Who was he? Why had he appeared on the most sacred day of her life? But minutes later, when a dozen U.S. Marines in full-dress uniform marched in and saluted the bride as though she were their commanding general, everything changed. Have you ever considered that a quiet act of kindness like leaving someone breakfast could redeem a soul you thought lost? And that the goodness you give never truly disappears, but waits for the perfect moment to return, like a miraculous gift? Stay with this story to the end, and if your heart stirs, share it because maybe someone you passed by today also needs to be seen as human. When the town of Flagstaff still lay silent under a thin veil of mist, and the distant mountain ridges had just begun to reveal themselves beyond the gray clouds, Abigail Moore was already starting another day. As the clock on the kitchen wall struck 4 a.m., she slipped on her pale silver running shoes, wrapped herself in the wool scarf her mother had left her, and stepped outside into the mountain morning's chill that hit her face like an uninvited embrace. She didn't complain, she never did. The Mesa Dawn Cafe sat at the end of Beaver Street, neither far from the station nor close to downtown. It was a small wooden house, painted in aged ivory, and every early opening filled the air with the scent of cinnamon, butter, and something softly inviting that made passers-by glance twice. Abigail was always the first to arrive, not merely out of duty as a baker, but because of a habit few knew of, and perhaps never needed to know. She began by lighting the oven, weighing flour, and mixing dough with a precision as if coded into her bones. Fine flour clung to her fingertips, the warm spice of cinnamon dusted the countertop like snow. Yet even in these practiced motions, her mind never fully remained in the kitchen. She kept an eye on the small clock above the shelf, waiting for the second hand to land exactly on 5:10 a.m. That was when she would gently retrieve a green food container, carefully place inside a freshly baked twist pastry apple and brown butter filling she knew he loved, most add a few slices of fresh orange, and finally a steaming cup of black coffee. No cream, no sugar, no questions asked. She wrapped it all in a thick napkin and slipped out the back door, across the alley leading to the little bus stop. There stood a single wooden bench, slightly tilted, its legs worn into Arizona's dry, sandy soil. On that bench, every morning, someone would be waiting. He was an elderly man, his silver beard stubbly, his hands always in fingerless gloves no matter the season. His moss-green jacket, faded and patched in multiple places, bore a frayed collar but was always pulled up delicately, as if by habit. His eyes were indescribable, at once gazing into nothingness and observing everything. They neither begged nor accused, neither thanked nor rejected. They simply were present. Abigail never asked his name, not because she didn't care, but because asking would have shattered something sacred happening quietly between them, and he never spoke a word. Yet for 7 years, each workday began with this ritual. She placed the food box on the bench. He offered a slight nod. She nodded back and walked away. No photographs were taken, no notes were made, no one ever asked why. Once, she had tried leaving town for 3 days to care for her ailing mother. During those 3 mornings, someone still sat on the bench, but the bench held no meal, no pastry, no coffee. And on the 4th morning, when she returned, he was still there. No questions asked, no reprimands given. He simply offered his quiet nod as always, and in his eyes, for the first time, there was a warmth more tangible than Flagstaff's chill. Most of the cafe's regulars never noticed him. Those who did might shrug, probably just some homeless old man hanging around. But to Abigail, he was the only person who made her mornings feel meaningful. Not because she desired thanks, but because each day, she was able to remind a soul forgotten by the world that someone still remembered him through a small meal and a simple nod. And sometimes, that alone is enough to keep a soul from slipping past the faint boundary between living and giving up. Abigail never told a soul about this. She didn't need to. For some acts of kindness only hold their true value when they remain unseen. And she believed, in some unspoken way, that he understood this too. Abigail was not the type of person to make noise in the kitchen. Her footsteps were always soft, and the taps of the dough on the countertop were as steady and rhythmic as a familiar whisper. Yet in that tranquil space, sometimes words need not be loud to fracture something fragile within. "She's wasting perfectly good food," a familiar voice said behind her one morning. It wasn't aimed directly at her, but was spoken loud enough for her to hear. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Abigail did not turn around. She continued slicing the butter and layering it on the rolled dough as if nothing had happened. But inside, a small wave had just risen quiet, smoldering insufficient to make her break, yet too persistent to vanish at once. Such remarks often flew back and forth in that warm kitchen. A place that should have held only the scent of sweet pastries, and the spirit of sharing sometimes became a stage for judgmental glances. People didn't understand why a high-quality pastry wasn't placed on the shelf for sale but was instead taken out the back door each morning. And Abigail didn't feel it necessary to explain. When the new manager was appointed, he approached her with gentle but clear words. "I know it's a humane act, Abigail," he began. "It's truly admirable. But several customers have complained. They feel uncomfortable seeing a homeless man loitering around the shop every morning." She was neither angry nor surprised. Abigail only nodded, then woke even earlier the next day. She slipped out of the cafe silently before anyone else arrived. The pastry was still baked to perfection, the coffee still steaming hot. The only difference was that no one saw her leave through the back door anymore. Everything seemed settled, at least on the surface. Until one winter morning, snow had fallen all night, blanketing rooftops, sidewalks, and the towering pine branches in thick white layers. Abigail cradled the food box in her hands, stepped out the back door and found him seated there. Not as usual, not like every other day. He was hunched on the bench, arms wrapped around his stomach, his back curved as if trying to make himself smaller against the biting cold seeping through his tattered layers. His fingerless gloves no longer sufficed to cover his bluish fingers. No words, no nod. Only his eyes fixed on her, this time deeper, more desperate, almost pleading. And it made her heart ache in a way it never had before. Without thinking, she removed the wool scarf from around her neck, the only thing shielding the skin between her collar and her loosely tied hair, and gently laid it beside the food box. She said nothing. She didn't want him to feel pity for the help. She only wanted him to know. She saw him. She still saw him. The next morning, when she returned to the familiar bench, Abigail found the food box neatly placed back, its lid secured. The wool scarf was gone, but something else remained. A crumpled napkin, damp with dew, yet still bearing a handwritten pencil message in shaky, slanted script. "Thank you for seeing me as a human being." Abigail held the paper in her hands, once icy cold. They now felt warm and alive. And later, in that kitchen, for the first time in years, she wept, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for the warmth to drip onto her flour dust-covered hands. She didn't tell anyone about the note, nor did she speak of the scarf. Some of the most precious things need not be shared. They need only to be treasured. 7 years is a long enough time for a habit to become a belief. And for Abigail, each morning at Mesa Dawn was more than just work. It was her own rhythm of life, a quiet corner she had carved out amid a noisy world. But now, everything was changing. Only days remained until her wedding, the kind of event Abigail herself had scarcely dared to imagine. Not because she didn't believe in love, but because she had always thought that someone like Harun, unremarkable, far from glamorous, could never be the focal point of any grand ceremony. Yet Mason had seen her. In the same way she had once seen the man at the bus stop. He was a firefighter, tall, composed, with a quiet gentleness that neither flaunted nor dramatized. He didn't propose with fireworks or a diamond ring, but with a steaming cup of tea on the night she collapsed from overtime, whispering, "Would you like to share this breakfast every day, From now on?" And she nodded. In the days leading up to the wedding, Abigail declined to hire a professional planner. She ordered her cake from the very place she worked, because it carried the scent of the life she had built, piece by piece. She handwrote every invitation, making sure no one at the bakery was left out, from the new assistant baker to the long-serving dishwasher. Mason would laugh as the guest list grew longer by the day. "Are you inviting the whole neighborhood?" he teased. "Only those who were there when I needed a smile," she replied, her voice as soft as the breeze rustling the pines beyond the porch. Then, 2 days before the wedding, an ivory envelope appeared in the cafe's mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Simply, "To Bride Abigail Moore," written on the front. Inside was a heavy cardno embellishments. No scent of perfume, just a raw white stock like the kind used in the military. The handwriting was unadorned, yet earnest. "I will come, not for the pastry, but to repay a debt." Abigail read the line over and over in the quiet kitchen. There was something in the slanted strokes, the uneven, faded ink, that stirred a vague memory within her. A familiar feeling she couldn't quite name. She closed the card and placed it on the wooden shelf where she kept the salt. No one asked about it. No one knew. Yet all that day, her hands trembled slightly as she kneaded dough. She poured more coffee than usual. And when evening fell, she lingered longer than ever before beside the lone wooden bench at the bus stop. The bench that day stood empty. No food box, no scarf, no old man. Only the wind and a strange silence that seeped into her heart. She wasn't entirely sure it was him. There was no proof. But deep down, something told her he would come. And strangely, that didn't fill her with fear. It filled her with anticipation. Dear audience, take a moment to relax or grab a glass of water, then continue listening to the story. More surprises await. Comment 1 if you're enjoying the tale so we know you're still here. In the small room reserved for the bride behind the church, Abigail stood silently before the pane of glass misted over with condensation. The click of high heels, murmured conversations, and the faint strains of prelude music drifting up from the hallel seemed to wash over her like silent waves, leaving no trace. Her hand, despite being carefully made up, still gripped the hem of her wedding gown as if for fragile support. She wasn't trembling from the cold. She trembled because of something both nebulous and intensely real. Then she saw him. He stood at the edge of the church porch, half hidden in the slanted morning sunlight. Gone was the frayed jacket, gone were the fingerless gloves. In its place was a light gray suit worn but impeccably press-tailored to his slender frame. His brown leather shoes were scuffed, yet polished to a mirror sheen by the weak light, reflecting off the stone steps. His hair was neatly combed, parted just as in an old photograph. And those eyes? They were still the same calm, silent gaze she had come to see every morning. But today, they held something more, a shy hesitation, and a profound, restrained gratitude. Abigail didn't wait any longer. She sought no one's permission. She didn't wait for the scheduled time. She lifted her wedding gown and strode down the corridor, her high heels clicking sharply against the worn tiles. The attendants froze. A bridesmaid opened her mouth to call out, then halted when she saw Abigail's expression resolute, yet brimming with emotion as if on the verge of overflowing. She flung open the wooden double doors and stepped outside. The morning air embraced her like a cleansing. Then she embraced him. Not the stiff, ceremonial kind of hug, but one of recognition, of acknowledgement, of longing. Her fingers gripped his back through the faded but clean fabric. He stood motionless for a moment, then slowly lifted his arms and returned the embrace, not tightly, but enough that the years of silence between them ceased to be an empty space. "I remember you, your eyes on that first day. In 2017, she whispered, her lips trembling. "I remember too. You treated me like a human being." His hoarse but clear voice echoed, like a long-forgotten melody played anew. They needed no more words. Everything had been expressed in those quiet mornings, in each cup of black coffee, in the old wool scarf she once left behind, and in the handwritten note she still carried in her wallet. Abigail slipped her arm through his, and together they walked into the church. The heavy double doors swung wide open not by a doorman, but as if the very air recognized the sanctity of the moment. Light flooded in, illuminating the two figures crossing the threshold, the bride radiant in her white gown, and the man once forgotten by the world, now stepping forward as the most honored presence of the ceremony. And then, before anyone could even comprehend what was unfolding, the rhythmic click of shoes echoed from outside. 12 U.S. Marines, in full ceremonial dress uniform, marched in with perfect formation. Their boots shone brightly, their white gloves bore not a single blemish. Their gazes were fixed straight ahead, proud, yet not unfeeling. The congregation fell silent. No one laughed, no one spoke. A few guests rose reflexively. Others gripped each other's hands tightly. They understood that this moment was no ordinary wedding. It was a moment of truth when quiet kindness is finally seen, and an invisible debt begins to be repaid with honor. The atmosphere inside the church seemed to freeze as the synchronized footsteps of 12 Marines echoed off every lofty arch and ancient floor tile. They advanced to the front row where the bride still linked arms with the elderly man, her eyes glistening yet bright, as though she had just witnessed something truly worthy of her faith. The formation halted with perfect precision. The commander, Captain Walker, stepped forward. He did not read from a prepared script, no need. Every word he spoke felt etched in the air, weightier than any military document. On behalf of Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, the 2nd of Marchin Regiment, his voice resonated through the weathered wooden beams. We are not here today to escort a bride or perform ceremony. We are here to honor the one who quietly nurtured a hero. A ripple of astonishment swept through the pews. Some guests exchanged surprised glances, eyes that had been skeptical moments before now fixed intently. Walker turned to the man standing beside Abigail, slender, slightly stooped, yet with a calm resolve shining in his gaze. Sergeant Robert Leland, he stated clearly, who carried 10 wounded Marines out of the fiercest fire zone in Marja, Afghanistan, in 2010. A man who not only preserved their lives, but also upheld the spirit of a unit on the brink of collapse. Abigail turned to look at him. In that moment, the pieces she had never asked about connected themselves. The calloused hands. His upright posture each morning, as if a soldier's habit. And the silence born of fear, but of choice. Walker continued, his voice now deeper. In 2015, after losing his entire family in a car accident, Sergeant Leland withdrew from civilian life, refused all benefits, and left no trace. For 8 years, he accepted no stipend, made no contact with his unit, and left no footprint. He paused for effect, until a Bakra woman with no rank, no credentials saw him. A younger Marine stepped forward, lifting a dark wooden box and opening its lid. Inside lay a silver medal, gleaming under the candlelight. Beside it was an old photograph slightly blurred, its edges frayed yet clear enough to show a man carrying a bloodied comrade through the ruins of shattered buildings. Walker spoke slowly. The man in that photo is me. The one carrying me is Sergeant Leland. Without him, I would not be standing here today. He bowed his head solemnly. And, without you, Abigail Moore, he might never have survived to see a day like this. Abigail did not cry. But her lips trembled, as if trying to hold back something too immense to name. Sergeant Leland looked at her, his own eyes glistened. He reached out and took her hand in silence. No speeches, no explanations needed. Because sometimes, the most profound thank you is simply choosing to be present. You saved the soul of a man who saved many lives, Walker concluded, then turned back to the formation. The church remained deathly still, as if any exhale might shatter the moment. No one applauded, for this was not a moment to cheer. This was a moment to bow. Abigail and Mason's honeymoon did not include a luxury resort, no beachfront wine dinners, nor dozens of selfie posts. They spent most of their time in a small pickup truck, following the northern Arizona Trail, stopping in little-known towns, sharing simple meals, and speaking softly about things that didn't need a loud voice. They didn't call it a honeymoon, they called it resetting their rhythm of life. When they returned, the wedding gift they chose to preserve was neither cash nor new furniture, but an idea and intention almost decided before the wedding day. They used all their gift money to lease a small corner beside the Mesa Dawn Bakery, where Abigail still worked part-time, and turned it into a humble wooden porch named the Quiet Porch. No neon sign, no slogan, just a hand-painted wooden board hung at the entrance, inscribed like a whisper. Each morning, a meal, no questions, no judgment. The Quiet Porch opens from 5:30 to 7:30 a.m., 5 days a week. Every morning, they set out a few wooden tables, a handful of mismatched folding chairs, and plates of warm pastries alongside cups of black coffee. Visitors may sit in silence and eat, or converse if they wish. No registration, no name-taking. On the small wall behind the service counter, Abigail framed the weathered note she had kept all year, the trembly napkin scrawled with, "Thank you for seeing me as a human being." Beneath it, in her own gentle script, she added, "Whoever sits at this table deserves to be heard." Word of the Quiet Porch spread person to person, not through newspapers or social media, but by those who stepped inside and left with something quietly changed in their hearts. A man who had served in Iraq brought an old tin box filled with photos of his unit and left it with Abigail as a way to entrust his memories. A middle-aged woman, streaked with gray hair and formerly a military nurse, would sit alone each morning with her coffee, then quietly wash her cup before leaving. They didn't share many words, but each presence was living testimony that war not only takes away, but also leaves behind, and sometimes those remnants need to be gently unpacked, bit by bit, through ordinary breakfasts. Mason understood this better than anyone. As a firefighter, he knew there are battles that leave no scars on the skin, but smolder quietly behind the eyes. He didn't say much, he was simply the first to clear the tables and the last to switch off the porch lights each day. And then a year passed. On the morning of their first wedding anniversary, Abigail arrived earlier than usual. As she opened the door to the Quiet Porch, she froze. There, in the dawn's soft glow, stood 12 men waiting. No longer in uniform, they wore simple civilian clothes, heavy jackets, knit caps, rough gloves. Yet their faces were the same, the Marines who had walked into her wedding a year before. Each carried a single flower. Not a word was spoken. Captain Walkerno, longer bearing rank, stepped forward and placed his blossom on the wooden table at the porch's center. He looked at Abigail and smiled. "We'll take turns volunteering here," he said. "This honor will not be forgotten." Abigail said nothing. She only nodded, her vision blurring not from simple emotion, but from certainty. Every belief she held, every small act she had performed, all of it had meaning. The Quiet Porch did not save the world, but it saved something of the human spirit. And sometimes, that alone is enough to name a new family. No blood relation required, only gratitude and presence. In a world full of noise, where worth is often measured by achievements and fame, Abigail's story reminds us that the smallest acts, a breakfast, a non-judgmental gaze, can make a profound difference. Sometimes, the only thing a person needs to rise again is the feeling of being seen, of being worthy of respect. Not every medal bearer needs a salute, and not everyone who lives quietly is without greatness. If you've ever believed that quiet kindness yields no result, remember that sometimes it returns in the form of 12 silent Marines bearing flowers. Thank you for listening to the end. If this story touched you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, a time you felt truly seen, or someone you've quietly helped. And don't forget to like and subscribe so we can spread more healing, humane stories like this. Because, as Abigail wrote, whoever sits at this table deserves to be heard.